I'm Mike, the co-founder of Haystack. Welcome to episode 5 of the Haystack Tech Uncovered podcast, where I'll be chatting with tech leaders, disruptors, academics and innovators about all things technology, software development and culture. Today, I'll be speaking with Sarat Pediredla. Sarat is a CEO of Northeast-based product consultancy Hedgehog Lab. Hedgehog Lab are experts in mobile development, design and product management, and have worked with some huge clients such as Microsoft, Deliveroo and Lloyds Bank. Welcome to the podcast. So you're the co-founder and CEO of Hedgehog Lab, which is a name synonymous with Northeast Tech. So I think a good place to start is probably at the beginning. So what actually sparked Hedgehog Lab?
Well, thank you for having me on the podcast, Mike. I think from my perspective, one of the reasons that I started Hedgehog Lab, ironically, although we're currently an agency and that's what we do, and I think thank you for that flattering description about being synonymous with Northeast Tech. Our original purpose for founding Hedgehog Lab wasn't actually to be an agency. We had a very simple theory when we used to work in the tech sector. Me and my co-founder were working in the tech sector in the Northeast, working in the agency business. And we had this really simple theory that I think, if you could get a bunch of talented people together and really create a workplace that removes all the typical corporate agendas, the complexity of big business, that they'll do some incredible work. And that was really the purpose and the theory behind founding Hedgehog Lab. At that time, we didn't necessarily have a plan in terms of what we were going to do, in terms of, whether we're going to do mobile apps, whether we're going to do web apps, etc. Originally, the company actually started as a product company, but we've evolved obviously naturally because of our backgrounds and the demand for where tech is into an agency.
Yeah, so where did your journey with tech actually begin then? Because from what I've just heard there, Hedgehog Lab has kind of molded and changed along the way. So how did you actually start your own career into tech, and how did you sort of spot this, gap in the market as well?
Yeah, that's a really interesting story, actually. So my pathway into tech was a weird one. I actually never really touched a computer until I was about 15 or 16.
Right.
I was actually studying to be a surgeon, actually. That was my background. I really wanted to be a doctor and a surgeon from when I was pretty young. And as part of my pre-med studies, my dad actually got me a computer. I've had Nintendo consoles and SNES, etc. before, but never a proper computer.
Yeah.
So I was a teenager, my dad got me a computer and it had all these, Harvard medical guides and Encarta encyclopedia. And so really he bought me a computer so I could study and watch a lot of these videos around pre-med school in terms of biology, chemistry, etc. But inadvertently, as you do, in 95, 96, I got my first PC. And the reality was, although I got the PC to learn about, medicine and, review journals, etc., and the internet was quite young, I got obsessed with it. I got obsessed with just learning a lot more about tech. I started to teach myself C++. Just because I had, as you're using things, you just got really fascinated by how some of these encyclopedia things were created, how the screens were working. As you do, as any teenager does, you get obsessed with game design and game development at that age. Yep. Within a year, I'd self-taught myself some of the most complex programming languages. I used to stay up until 4 a.m. on my PC. And then just, I think about a year and a half, when I got really good at C++, it just inevitably became a revelation to me, although I just entered med school at that time. So I got into med school. And I think I did about 3 months in there. And in the back of my mind was this thing where I just felt like technology was pulling me a lot deeper in than my original, ambition, which was I originally wanted to be a neurosurgeon. And so eventually, at that age, I think just when I was 17, I ended up realizing I preferred computers to human brains. And I decided to kind of pivot and move into the tech sector, really.
Yeah. So how did you make that move initially? Because I imagine it's probably quite a daunting daunting jump from going from wanting to be a neurosurgeon to wanting to be a computer programmer. Was it kind of a university experience that sort of encouraged you to go down that route? Did you take a computer science degree, or was it all just sort of I guess this self-taught mentality and let's see if I can just pick up projects where I can find them?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I was self-taught. And then once I got the kind of the programming bug and the tech bug, I was obsessed. I used to live in Dubai, and I was creating e-commerce stores. And this was in 97, 98. And e-commerce wasn't really a thing. I think Amazon had just launched, and we were experimenting with a lot of really cool ideas. So no, I didn't really. I did go to university to study computer science, but it was actually on the back of my pivot. So when I said I got into med school, 3 months in, I announced to my dad that I don't want to do medicine anymore, and that really what I want to do is do computers. The problem I had was all my life I was preparing for med school, and particularly with my background, I come from India. I was born in India. Really, the way parents expect you to do things is you got to study at the best of the best of the best. So my dad's ambition was, I was originally supposed to go to Harvard medical. Actually, that was I got into the prep school for Harvard. So my dad went, okay, well, the natural outcome of that is, you'll have to go to MIT or Stanford or Harvard. But the problem was, because I was studying for medicine, my preparatory subjects weren't relevant for computer science. So I couldn't actually get into computer science. So I did end up going to university just to please my parents, really. I mean, I think in my first year at university, I remember they had a programming course and I got 98% on it out of 100. And I was bored because everything that they were teaching me, I taught myself: data structures, algorithms, recursive lists, all these things I taught myself over the last 2.5 years. So university was really just a backstop to really make my parents happy that I was doing something organized and educative. But really, most of my learning happened either self-taught or I actually got my first job, I think, when I started programming just after that. And I worked for Oracle in the Middle East as a contractor. So a lot of the stuff I learned either freelancing on the job or self-taught, really. University was a great experience, not necessarily for the education, more for understanding, how the wider world works. Because, I remember I went to Southampton, and there was a lot of, interest in those years around business incubators, startups, etc. So it gave me what university did was give me taste for business, whereas I was always passionate about technology and programming. University really kind of opened the world up to me in terms of the possibilities of what, technology can do in the business world, really.
Yeah, definitely. I completely agree. I think universities has a place a lot of time to build these kind of fundamentals and I guess give you the core understanding of I guess programmatic fundamentals. But the biggest learning curve for an engineer is learning on the job, in my opinion. A lot of the times you just kind of have to throw yourself into the deep end and figure out problems, figure out the best solution around it and kind of apply this knowledge that you've built up either, I don't know, as a bedroom code or as just a general problem solver. And I think a lot of the great software engineers that you see are just generally just hobbyists and like tinkering with things.
I agree. And I think, my co-founder was the same. Although he went to university to do computer science, a lot of the good stuff he really taught himself. I mean, he was into music, and really what he started doing was experimenting a little bit with some of the musical equipment, etc. And that's where he got really passionate. So some of the best programmers I've seen, certainly, actually, I mean, I know a lot of programmers that haven't even done a computer science degree. They do a humanities degree or they do an economics degree, but actually they train themselves. So I totally agree. I think education is important. I mean, I'm not saying, ignore education, because where computer science education is now, in this decade is really powerful and really good. But ultimately, I don't think you can beat the ability to challenge yourself and do things by yourself. So having a lot of interest, like working on open source programs, doing a lot of your pet projects. These are the kind of things I look for when we hire programmers. So it's a super important thing.
Yeah, I think it's interesting you mentioned humanities, and I guess there's also a lot of other fields where the lines are starting to become more blurred in engineering. So I don't know, human psychology, for example. There's so many different applications for a software engineer to move into, I guess, a psychological background as well, and start applying code and standards to that area. I'm quite interested to find out, how did you make this kind of jump? So you mentioned you worked with e-commerce, and you mentioned you were contracting at Oracle. So how did you make the jump into tech leadership? And did you feel like that was a big jump?
It was definitely a big jump for me. I think one of the things I realized pretty early, so when I was young, from the age of 17 to about 23, 24, a lot of the work I did was around contracting and being a freelancer. And while I really enjoyed programming, I started to recognize that I'm not a person that works well in isolation. Ironically, I'm actually a fairly introverted person, but I just felt where I did my best work was when I went in and worked in teams and worked together with teams. So obviously tech leadership per se happened naturally because I founded my company quite young. And ultimately, when you found your company, you kind of evolve into that founder CEO role. And, some people move away from it, some people adapt it. But from my perspective, one of the things I realized pretty early on, and this is a big thing for me in terms of evolution as a programmer, and I think a lot of the young programmers these days miss it, is a large part of your job as a programmer is to work in teams to achieve outcomes. And when I was doing the contractor piece, I felt isolated. A lot of the times I used to do individual contracts. Sometimes I'd go in and work as part of other teams. And I felt like the times I really enjoyed stuff was when I worked in teams. And obviously, when I set up the company, it was a natural evolution that if I'm going to create a team, I'll need to lead it and evolve it. It was inadvertent. I didn't set out to be in tech leadership. I set out to form a company, to do what I wanted, to have the freedom to really make my choices. And obviously, as the company grew and it became a beast and there was more and more demand and the organization grew, I just kind of fell into tech leadership. It wasn't a strategy or a plan to get into it, really.
Yeah. So how did you find that jump, I guess, from sort of being a lone wolf kind of software engineer where you only have to worry about yourself and worry about your own code base, essentially, to, I guess, running a business and having to not only worry about obviously building and deploying code, but also all of the other parts that go side by side with running the business? Because I've had quite a similar path. I moved from being a software engineer to all of a sudden diving into the world of business. And for me, it was a massive learning curve, and it's kind of one of those where you sort of have to sink or swim, I think.
I think that was actually a positive thing for me. So, going back to how I learned programming, the best way I learned programming was doing stuff and being in the deep end. And I had to create a program or I had to create a game. For example, when I was doing the job and I did the contract jobs, I was being paid a lot of money for this, right? So like my neck was on the line. Like, I wouldn't get paid and I wouldn't feed myself if I didn't finish this website or web app or program for the customer. So you had no choice. Like I said, you had to sink or swim. If you don't, then you don't get paid. You don't get, you don't get to do stuff. So I think I took that similar approach to business. When I started the business, what I was good at was being a really good programmer. I had no other skills. I couldn't sell, I couldn't market, I couldn't lead, etc. In fact, I remember the first thing I said to my co-founder, because both of us were engineers, I turned around to him and I remember in we set up in this little warehouse place in South Shields. I turned around to him and said, "How do you do sales?" And literally, it's one of the first things I typed into Google, like, how do you sell? And so, in a way, everything we learned on the job, how to do financials, how to do, etc. It was just basically, I think that's the best way I learn. If I had to go and do an MBA, I tell people I had the best MBA, I 5-10 years of running the company, but I don't think if I had to go and learn business school, I probably wouldn't have been as engaged as almost. For me, I'm a very much a growth oriented person. It's about how can I grow every day. And so all of these challenges for me really came as a positive. I never really got stressed. I never really got upset. The only two negatives, I guess, was I started quite young, and one of the big mistakes I made, because I was quite an egotistical programmer, was I didn't really get any mentors. And in retrospect, if I could go back 15 years, I'd probably advise a lot of young people starting up to get mentors and get that support, because we were quite bullish about you almost over-assess your own abilities as opposed to, what a mentor or a support person can do. And the second thing is, as a programmer, talking about leadership, I had very little patience for people because I was a high-performing programmer. If people weren't the best at what they did, I didn't want to deal with them. I didn't want to hire them. I remember the first 2 years, we'd only hire the best of the best of the best of the best. And the reality is, as I've evolved, I've started to understand that that's not really a high performance model. If you have 10 Messis in a team or 11 Messis in a team, you're not necessarily going to score 20 goals in a match. And so that's been a big evolution. I used to have really little patience although ironically, I was growth oriented. I didn't give people the benefit of the doubt. I was very much about judging people on how not brilliant they were. And it was very, very much around merit. And, either somebody was great or either they were really poor. There was no kind of middle path. So those were the two negatives, I think, of coming from a programmer's world. I saw everything as binary, 0 or 1. As I've evolved in leadership, I've started to learn that actually great programmers come from all walks of life. And it isn't just about how much code you can create. It's not about doing the matrix in your sleep. It's actually, a lot more other things that become part of being a good developer and a good engineer, really.
Yeah. So rewind back a little bit. One of the most important aspects of starting a business is having this kind of this vision. So what does Hedgehog Lab actually stand for as a business, and what is your North Star?
This is something, ironically, we wrote our culture framework. So we have a culture framework that's been the same for the last 14 years. And before I founded the business, I actually wrote down the culture framework. And the purpose of the business is to create a place that empowers talented people to do the best work of their life. Now, what you'll find interesting in that is there's nothing there that says we're going to do mobile apps. There's nothing there that says we're going to do even software. The idea was that as an organization, we might evolve. Next year, we might be doing augmented reality, VR. In 10 years, we might be a product company. I just don't know where we'll be. But the core philosophy was this idea of building high-performing teams. You bring a bunch of talented people together, remove the roadblocks and all the corporate kind of, complexity that normally gets introduced. Actually, my theory is simple about most companies. I think most companies start off as great companies. In the early stages, they have the best processes, the best people, they have the best. And as they evolve into an enterprise, that's when all the unnecessary stuff comes in, the craft, the politics. So the purpose of it was always been the same. In terms of what we want to do, that's changed a couple of times. And currently, our vision is definitely to be the most respected tech consultancy, globally. And that's kind of what drives us. But ultimately, the purpose has always been, how do we get a bunch of really talented people together, create the right environment for them to do the best work of their life?
I think I read somewhere that you guys pivoted to go after the mobile market quite significantly. How did you identify that as a trend? And how has the business shifted from what I guess was the initial idea or the initial thought process you had kind of 10, 15 years ago?
Yeah, the initial idea was actually, it was the worst thing to do in 2007, 2008. Initial idea was we were actually building a SaaS platform, a product platform for the financial services industry. So you talked about, the pandemic being a bad time to launch a business. I'll tell you what's the worst thing: to launch a financial services business 6 months before the meltdown of the global financial crisis.
Yeah, that's bad timing, I think.
So we ended up building this product that was exclusively for financial services institutions, spent 6 months of our life savings, everything, with mortgages, etc. We had a great product that nobody wanted to buy because it was very specific to banks and credit card companies, etc. So the first pivot was just, literally survival pivot. We just didn't know what else to do. And we went back to doing what we were good at, which was doing websites and web agencies and web apps and stuff like that. And, there's always been demand for that. If you have talent in terms of, being able to code and create. I remember the first couple of gigs, we literally contracted ourselves out as a company, individuals to the client. The mobile piece, I think, was really interesting. While the financial crisis was happening, obviously the iPhone launched, I believe in 2007, just as we founded the company. And I remember being one of the first in lines in, I think it was the Apple store had just opened in Newcastle then. And I remember being one of the first people in line to buy an iPhone when it launched. To be honest, I saw the vision of it pretty quickly because I remember in my younger years doing a lot of contracting work on BlackBerry and Nokia and stuff.
Yeah.
And although the tech was clunky, you could sense something was happening with the technology, and the iPhone really broke that barrier. The problem we had was, although the iPhone launched in 2007, the SDK didn't appear until a couple of years later, and mobile apps weren't really a thing until about 2010. So while we had a pretty early inkling, I remember saying to my co-founder, this mobile thing is going to be big, and we were experimenting and playing with it. No one really was kind of building apps at the scale that we do right now. There were very few businesses that were app-based businesses. There were very few enterprises that were investing in apps. The people that were doing apps were the people that did stuff like games, or the people that actually produced apps for the App Store, as opposed to a business backed by apps. But I think about 2010, 2011, we could see the market was starting to shift. And what we were doing, which was building websites, was becoming very, very commoditized. I mean, I remember the pivotal moment for us was, I remember we were pitching for a tech organization, etc., and they were doing a new website. And as usual, they put it out to 4 or 5 people. And it was basically, it was a tough time in the web business. And I remember we thought the work was worth about 40K. So we said, but we desperately need work. We're not winning any work in the web agency world, because there's a lot of cutthroat competition. So we said, we'll bid 20K for it. And we bid 20K. We got a call back from the customer. Said, Sarat, your proposal was the best. We loved your creative ideas. In terms of what you're proposing, yours was the best. But unfortunately, someone agreed to do it for half the price that you're going to do it. So they went with somebody that decided to do it for 10K. And that's when the penny dropped for us, that there was nothing we were doing that was unique. There was no positioning here. There was nothing that really made people sit up and look and go, Hedgehog Lab is unique. And that's when, in 2011, we decided to pivot completely to a mobile positioning. And we've kind of largely stuck with that for the last 10 years.
So obviously the mobile technologies were they weren't necessarily mature at that stage. No. So how did you upskill your team? How did you upskill yourself into becoming basically experts in the field?
Yeah, that's a really good one. So it was 50-50 really. So by that time, I think we had about 6 or 7 people. So half the team didn't want to upskill. Quite rightly, right. They made a decision. They had mortgages to pay. They, some of them had families, etc., and they just couldn't take the risk because that was not the skills they had. There was literally me, my co-founder, and one kid who was an intern who had nothing to lose. He was living with his parents. Yeah. And we all just went, yeah, that's fine. Let's just retrain. So it wasn't like a gradual thing. I mean, although we've been dabbling with iOS app development for a couple of years, it was all in or nothing. I remember we canceled any new client contracts that were coming. We stopped taking web work. Wow. We went from making some revenue, enough revenue to pay 7 or 8 people, to literally not enough to even sustain a 3 people wage. I remember all 3 of us basically said, we're not going to take a pay for 6 months. And we just retrained ourselves, literally spent the 6 months building demo apps, demo platforms. And this goes back to my original thing. We've always been self-taught people. If I want to learn something, I'd rather do stuff and build stuff rather than, try and look at online guides or go to classroom training. So we took a pretty drastic decision to almost stop everything and do a complete pivot. So it was tough. But at that time, it didn't make sense to do anything else because it was a race to the bottom anyway, doing what we were doing, selling websites, etc.
Yeah. That's the definition of backing a pivot there. That's amazing. I've never heard anybody go all in like that.
Yeah.
So,
And to be honest, at that time, I can say now that we were so sure it was going to work. But trust me, at that time, we weren't sure. In fact, I remember after the 6 months, we started, going to sell out mobile apps and say, do you want us to build mobile apps? A couple of things. I mean, I remember having a meeting with somebody. We got really excited. They were a Northeast company. They wanted to do an e-commerce app, mobile app, and e-commerce apps were quite a new thing in 2011, 2012. So we had this meeting set up, and he sent us a brief, and we were really excited. And I remember going to the meeting, and I said, "This is brilliant. So what's your budget?" And he said, "I've got £500 for this." and so I remember coming out of that and saying to Mark, "What the hell have we done here?" Because we've gone from kind of the pan into the fire kind of situation.
Yeah.
And it was really tough the first couple of years because, while mobile was starting to become a big thing across the world, it wasn't inevitable. There wasn't a lot of people willing to pay hundreds of thousands of pounds for mobile apps in the Northeast. So It was a real struggle the first couple of years.
Yeah, well, I would imagine there wasn't the Ubers and the Deliveroos around at that time, so it hadn't really reached that kind of mass market adoption where big enterprise companies were really utilizing mobile apps.
Yeah.
You said that at the stage of a company where they're at this kind of startup level, and it's a small team of basically the A team, and it's kind of as the business starts to scale and as it starts to grow, that's when difficulties start to arise in the team. So how did you stay lean and maintain a high performing team throughout these kind of growth stages that you went through and as Hedgehog Lab started to mature?
Well, I think with a lot of difficulty and making loads of mistakes, right? I mean, again, I think I'd be lying to say that we saw every single problem that we could foresee. I think we were lucky because we were in an industry that was quite niche. Not many of the mistakes we made were catastrophic. We were able to kind of weather because of our unique positioning, etc. Honestly, I think we just did through a lot of trial and error. We made so many mistakes in terms of getting the right team. I think we've had at least 3 false starts, really. This is after the pivot. Obviously, remember, at the pivot, we lost kind of half our team and there was only 3 people left. But even after the pivot, I remember, it was a tough going couple of years. And I think as soon as we hit the £1 million mark, we had a real problem. And when we hit a £2.5 million, we had another problem in terms of, it's almost the people that are, the right people for those early stages. So the young intern that was working with us, I have a lot of time for him. And, he's gone on to do brilliant things. But he wasn't the right person to work in a £5 million business. So, and a lot of my early team actually left because they said it doesn't feel like. I remember, one of the jokes we used to have was there was time when we used to have team meetings, town halls. We could all sit around an Ando's table and that's it, 10 of us. And I remember some of my team as we grew said, I don't want to work in a 30, 40 people company. I'm not comfortable. I want this to be everybody's mates and everybody. And so you evolve through that and you just recognize that people aren't always the right fit. The person who can sell for £1 million company is not the person that can sell for a £10 million company. Some people can evolve. I'm not saying that's a generic rule. I've certainly evolved as the company has grown. My co-founder has evolved. There are people that have grown companies to 100 million, 1 billion, the Bezoses and Gates. So there are always outliers, but most people have very particular skills and capabilities that either work in a startup, in a scale-up, or in a larger organization. So I think one of the mistakes I made in the early phases was because me and my co-founder evolved with the business, I resisted this idea that people would naturally move on, that different stages of the company would need different type of people. I think it's only after a couple of trial and errors when things got bad, we kind of almost retrospectively looked at it and went, heavens, that person wasn't right for the role, or, we should have done this 16 months ago, etc. So it was a lot of trial and error. I think, I don't think we had a particular strategy. We were very naive. We just thought people will just grow with us. They'll stay with us for 10 years. And it wasn't the right thing. Even if they wanted to stay with us, sometimes we actually realized they weren't the right people to take us into the next phase.
Yeah, so I guess your hiring mentality has to change at each phase of business growth.
100%.
I mean, we can see it firsthand at Haystack. When we hired developers initially, we wanted people who were basically in this hacker mentality, who could build, ship code quickly, just get it out there, get it in front of customers and see how they responded. So how has it matured? How has your hiring mentality matured as the business started to grow, specifically in engineering, I would say?
Yeah, absolutely. And like I said, in the early days, my engineering hiring requirements was, are you really, really good? In terms of programming, and, can you kind of, code with your eyes closed, in the parallel of where we were. And it was all about technical tests. It was all about how well you knew technical concepts. It was all about your engineering prowess. And as we grew as a business and as we grew as a commercial team, when you realize that actually a lot of what we're doing is for customers that are paying us money, and as you recognize that as a business, as you evolve, your engineers are speaking to your customers. And we were woefully unprepared for engineers to speak to customers. They just didn't have the soft skills. Some of our engineers were rude to customers. Some of them panicked. They would sweat going into meetings. And pretty quickly, we started understanding that actually the nature, you're right, in the early days, we had one project manager or somebody managing it and a bunch of engineers. But as we went higher up the food chain and started to compete with some of the bigger agencies, we just recognized that we need a different type of engineer. The other thing we realized was individual brilliance, while was important, had to be subservient to team performance. And that's where I said my growth has come from. When I was younger, I believed too much in individual brilliance. It was all about, A players, and it was having a team of 11 Messis, etc. And we actually tried that, and it was horrible because they were all kind of, no one was passing to each other. Everybody was just trying to kick the ball into the goal, and there was no teamwork. And so for us, it's understanding that there are individual roles to play in a team, and not all engineers need to be technically brilliant. We actually need engineers who are capable of presenting concepts to customers. We need engineers who can think in abstract. We need engineers who can tell you every bit of Kotlin from the top of their head. So we need a diverse set of engineers. And it wasn't just about merit. It was actually about what are the commercial realities of the kind of business we're building. So we started valuing things like customer service skills a bit more. We started valuing things like communication skills, written skills, working with teams, collaboration, leadership. So all these things started becoming a lot more important than can you code? Because reality, I remember, although I don't recruit engineers directly now, I remember when I literally said, look, realistically, there's nothing on Stack Overflow that you can't copy. So I really don't care whether you know how, a function works in JavaScript or whatever. A lot of my questions were around how do you work with teams? How do you deal with problems, etc. So that's been the evolution. We're starting to look at engineers. Of course, you've got to have basic competency because you can't be a bad engineer in terms of not understanding the core programming language you're working for. But that's taken for granted. But once we get past that core competency, I think a lot of the focus is on some of the cultural, the soft skills aspect of doing things.
Yeah, so actually, let's dive into the Hedgehog Lab culture a little bit. You mentioned you've got quite a comprehensive culture deck. And I think great culture is obviously a super subjective topic and can be quite hard to pin down. And a lot of companies seem to think that great culture just means a ping pong table and a coffee machine. So how have you nurtured the Hedgehog Lab culture, and what steps have you actually put in place to essentially establish those cultural foundations?
Yeah, and again, in the early days, because we were a young company, culture was about what we said, so we wrote, like I said, we have a culture framework, we wrote it down. But pretty soon what we started to recognize was what we said didn't necessarily match what we were doing. It was nice to be on posters and we were saying things like our team are our greatest asset. And actually, sometimes we were treating our team pretty poorly. We were overworking them. We were getting through. And so one of the evolution in terms of culture, you're right. I think for me, the evolution has been culture is not what you say, it's what you do. It's a collective set of behaviors. And actually, although a culture framework is codified in a document, actually what I think culture really is the day-to-day interactions, the way you behave, the things you say yes to, the things you say no to, the way you hire people, what are the criteria you use. So we've now started to understand culture a bit more. I mean, the culture framework almost is almost like a textbook for where we came from and what our thinking was. But actually, the way we look at culture now is the living, breathing things we do every day. What are the things I would challenge people on? What are the things I would let people get away with? What are the things that, are absolute red lines in the business? So for us, culture is almost this living, breathing organism. It's a sum of all the parts. And again, I grew up thinking culture was a pretty standard thing. Like you had a culture, Apple has a culture, Microsoft has a culture, etc. And actually, again, what you realize if you go to the growth mindset is even in one organization over a period of a decade or so, the culture evolves. Sometimes the culture can be toxic, stressful, negative. And actually, you can evolve that culture. So when people look at a culture of a business negatively, I say, don't think of that as a fixed point. I mean, actually, by doing the right things, bringing the right kind of people, etc., you can evolve the culture of a business. So one of my big jobs as CEO now is to work on the culture of our business. And what that means is all the things we say, are we doing them and how are we doing them and what are the things that matter to us? So for me, culture is like a living, breathing thing. And it's unique to that set of people that are in an organization at a given time.
Yeah, I think it's quite a refreshing take, actually, because, like you said, it's fine to write a culture deck, but you actually have to action the culture deck and make sure that you essentially live and breathe it. It's always one of the first things that any startup does in the early days. It's almost like a checklist. Let's try a culture deck.
And trust me, it's so difficult. And like I said, I will not lie. We got it wrong a lot of the times. And we had people challenge us and say, hold on, you're putting up all these nice posters, but the reality is things aren't great. People are underpaid. People are feeling stressed, etc. So, but that's okay. I think, the idea is that no one's aspiring to this perfect utopian culture where you come into work and it's all unicorns and rainbows, etc. There will always be difficult things to do. And I think as long as you recognize, and that's why I always talk about the growth mindset, as long as you recognize that it can be better tomorrow than it was yesterday, that's the most important thing. And like you said, have the will to do it. And I think that's the big thing. The senior management team has to have the will to change the culture. I've worked in businesses where senior management spent too much time complaining about a bad culture, but actually not doing anything about it. And I think that's the bit where things get really dangerous, where people complain too much, but aren't, part of the solution.
Yeah, definitely. So moving on to the slightly more technical side of Hedgehog Labs, obviously you work with a huge variety of clients now, and I'm always interested to hear about the groundwork that actually goes into making sure that you're building the right thing for your clients, because I think it's one thing coming and delivering a load of requirements and then shipping those requirements, but if nobody actually uses it, then it's not necessarily money well spent. So how do you guys help to solve that kind of product market fit problem? And how do you work side by side with the clients to basically deliver what the expectations that they have?
Yeah, and again, this has been a real evolution of our business. When we started the business, it was just a bunch of engineers. And like you said, we take a spec and we build something and, God, if it looks great or works, it's not our problem. You gave us a spec, we built it. And pretty soon we evolved into this thinking of actually, and as you guys might know at Haystack, that building a product is so much more about nice screens or great technology. So we brought in pretty early design capabilities into the business. I hired a guy called Ray Clark who had run his own business to run our design team. And that made a huge difference because really, design for us is not about what it looks like, but how it works. So we started to think about, like I said, what is the outcomes here? What are we trying to achieve? How will customers use this, etc.? Then as that evolved, we brought in a product functionality into the business. So we now claim to be a multidisciplinary, end-to-end product studio. And that's the reality. So we're looking at the product management angle of it. So actually, why are we building this? What's the business case here? What's the business needs here? What's the business analysis? How are we building it? The tech architecture, the design, etc. So I think one of the things that's unique about us, unlike a lot of agencies that focus either completely on design or completely on tech or sometimes even product is we've got a good multidisciplinary mix, and using that product and design teams working with engineers. So the idea is not that they all work separately, they all work together.
Yeah.
That's where I think we're removing the risks for the customers, making sure we're building the right product market fit, that we're doing a lot of the product stuff that we do is actually very akin to stuff that Google or Facebook would do internally. We take those product management practices and we're effectively trying to sell that to customers. So for a lot of customers, we're effectively an outsourced product team. They trust us to conceptualize, create the product, build it and run it for them. And that's the real value. So really what we are is a tech team for hire. You can hire your entire, you don't need to have a product manager, a designer, a developer, etc. And for a lot of businesses, that's obviously, particularly if it's not core business, it's a cost they don't want to bear.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of people just kind of throw consultancy a load of money and then sort of wait for the 1 million users to come and they never turn up. And I think that's one of the biggest mindsets that a lot of people have to get out of is put something out there, rapidly test it, rapidly iterate on the analytics that you gather. Just out of interest, what's one of the coolest projects you guys have worked on?
Unfortunately, there's one that we've worked in the financial services space, which I can't speak about because this is only a disadvantage of being an agency. Sometimes you're doing like really cool cutting edge stuff, which even the client themselves doesn't want to talk about. So we're really proud of that. So I think I can speak broadly about it, and it's in kind of the investment. We're really excited because I think it impacts lots of people. You're talking hundreds of thousands, potentially even millions of people, and it's about financial well-being and about securing their futures, etc. So we're excited about that. In terms of one of the public things that we can talk about, which is very pertinent to the pandemic last year, is we worked with the Newcastle City Council and the Ministry for Local Government on a platform called How Busy is Toon, which is a great platform. What was interesting about it was at a time where people were really worried about the rejuvenation of the town center. I mean, I remember I used to be worried about going into town because I didn't know, whether it was going to be busy, whether people were just going to be willy-nilly just walking around, etc. So the work we did there has actually helped shaped. In fact, we did it for Newcastle, but there was a plan to effectively take it national because we are going to have to live with COVID, and this is the future of how things are going to be. There will be outbreaks, there will be seasonal issues, and that platform is really helping, the town center rejuvenation, helping people get back to town centers safely, providing them information, etc. So that's one we're really proud of in terms of impact and tech for good. However, like I said, the financial services product that we're creating, I think, it certainly impacts a lot more people in a way that is close to our heart.
That's a great name for a project, that one.
Yeah.
So I'm interested, given the fact that you seem to spot the mobile trend quite early on, what future technologies are you most excited about at the minute?
To be honest, I wouldn't even say future, they're current, but we were really excited about augmented reality and virtual reality.
Yeah.
The challenge we're seeing is in the agency space, I don't think customers are fully cottoned on into the real excitement around what augmented reality and virtual reality can do. I think there's a lot of people in the product space doing interesting things. I mean, I saw something recently when Facebook was promoting its Metaverse. Obviously, you'll see that's probably the biggest bellwether in terms of Facebook committing to change its name to Meta.
Yeah.
But we think, augmented and virtual reality is a big thing. But I think the frustrating thing is, I think a lot of companies are experimenting with it. You see what IKEA is doing with augmented reality, etc. I think the potential for it is much higher than what the investment in it is. And I do think, with the news of potentially what Apple's doing in the AR space, we think it's the next evolution of mobile. So thinking along that mobile stream, spatial computing, AR, augmented reality, VR, we think will be the next frontier. So, like Mark Zuckerberg, unfortunately, we're pretty excited about the metaverse in the future.
I've got to ask, what are your thoughts on the metaverse?
I mean, but the thing is, the metaverse has been around. I mean, I don't know if you know about Second Life. Second Life has been around for 15 years. I mean, we used to actually have a head of XR called Sean, who created one of the first virtual Second Life like job centers and stuff like that. So I think that the thing is, it's been around for a long time. But what I think is technology now is caught up to the stage. If you saw some of the concept videos that Mark Zuckerberg shared there, I think we're starting to realize that Minority Reports kind of world where everything's projected, holograms, etc.
Yep.
So you're going to move away from physical screens, and the idea that you could take your computer with you and effectively, you could just project stuff in 3D space. So yeah, I think it's quite exciting, and I think that's the natural evolution of computing, right? Right from Asimov and Arthur C. Clarke's days, the future of computing is to move away from this bulky, devices. Even the phone, I think, will evolve into some miniaturized, kind of projected holograph thing. Yep. So yeah, I mean, I'm pretty excited. I'm a natural geek. I'm pretty excited about where technology will go. The other technology we're really excited about, and I think we're already starting to see, is AI. I don't think we've scratched the surface of what is possible with AI at this moment. I think a lot of the AI investment currently has been in simple things like machine learning or image recognition, etc. I think computational AI, has a lot more to go, particularly as if you look at some of the stuff that Apple is inventing with AI on the chip. Some of that stuff, I think, is really revolutionized every industry, everything from recruitment to all the way to traditional industries. And I think that's quite exciting.
I guess on the flip side as well, are there any technologies that you're particularly skeptical about or that make you nervous?
They don't make me nervous, but I was quite bullish on blockchain a couple of years ago, but I'm still not seeing the point. I mean, I like the hype around NFTs and stuff. Yep. It's great as a gimmick, but I really don't see the point. I mean, I know I have friends who created NFTs and made some money out of it, etc., but I don't really see the point. I mean, I think blockchain is useful. And I'm also not massively bullish on cryptocurrency. I can see what people are saying, and great, if you bought some Bitcoin and made $1 million from it, great. The environmental aspect of it is not great. And I don't know how it's sustainable because, mining things is getting more difficult and difficult as the years go. What do you need? A computer the size of the moon in about 50 years to mine a single Bitcoin? I'm not sure how it scales in the future. So I'm not bullish on blockchain and cryptocurrency and NFTs right now.
So you're not holding any Dogecoin then?
Funnily, I have a lot of crypto only because, as you do, you go with the zeitgeist, and I'm sure we'll do something gimmicky with NFTs. But the point is, I don't see it as life changing like the way AI will do or AR or VR will. I think it's a bit of entertainment. It's people experimenting. I like the fact that we can experiment and innovate. I think there will be some form of it which will settle, but in the current shape, the crypto space is not sustainable at all.
So I'm getting to the end of my questions now, Sarah. Just to wrap things up, I was wondering, do you have any advice for anyone looking to start a tech business in the same space as Hedgehog Lab?
Yeah, I mean, my advice is kind of threefold, really, from my perspective. Definitely get a little bit of experience. Don't do what I did, which is sit on a desk and go, how do you do sales? Get yourself prepared a bit more. I think that would definitely be one piece of my advice. The second piece of my advice, which I tell a lot of people, is if you're going to find a business, try and do it with a co-founder. I think a lot of people take it for granted how difficult it is. There are lots of solo business people, and I'm sure, you hear all the great stories where they miss out the second person. So everybody talks about Steve Jobs, but they don't talk about the other Steve. So same, everybody talks about Bill Gates, but they don't talk about the other founders. So, the reality is, I think any business is really difficult to start. And I think if you can't get one other person to buy into that vision, if you can't get one other person that excited about the concept and the business, then I think it'll be a tough path ahead for you. So I think certainly try and find co-founders to start your business with. It'll make your journey much smoother. And the third one is, obviously, if you can't find co-founders, or even if you do, make sure you're reaching out to mentors and experts and advisors. And don't be arrogant enough to think, you're going to just do it by yourself and achieve everything. So that's my 3 pieces of advice.
Good advice there. Do you have any news that you'd like to share?
So obviously, because it's the Haystack podcast, if anybody is listening, we're still recruiting. We're recruiting through Haystack, outside Haystack. If you're looking for a job and you want to work for one of the top-rated tech companies in the UK, please reach out.
Good stuff. And where can people connect with you online?
The best place for I'm both on Twitter and LinkedIn. It's just both my profiles are my first name and surname, Sarat Pediredla. So you can find me on Twitter or LinkedIn generally. I'm not cool enough to be on Instagram and the other platforms. So professionally, certainly Twitter and LinkedIn are the platforms to connect with me.
Good stuff. Well, thank you very much, Sarat. That was really interesting.
Thanks, Mike.
Thanks again to Sarat. Make sure you check out the next episode of the Haystack Tech Uncovered podcast.